Chapter 17. It took another day in Rio Sucio to put everything together. Schaefer had thought he had all the supplies he needed, but the guide had other ideas. He found 2 mules and stocked up on rope, blankets, camping gear, and arcane herbal remedies, as well as more mundane concerns such as food and fresh water, and a few boxes he didn't bother to open for his unappreciative gringo employer. No weapons were visible anywhere in the guide's acquisitions though, not even a knife. Schaefer noticed that and asked about it. The guide shrugged. "You have already done that, senor. I will trust you to have what we need." Later, as they were climbing the ridge, the mules zigzagging back and forth up the slope, the guide told Schaefer that he used to do recon work for the US military. Schaefer didn't argue with that or ask for proof, but he didn't necessarily believe it either. The guide might trust Schaefer as far as the armaments went, but Schaefer didn't trust the guide about weapons or previous recon work or anything else. But then, Schaefer didn't trust much of anyone, and nobody at all in that particular hellhole. "What you're looking for, these 6 men who came here 8 years ago," the guide had said. "I think for that, you want to head up to Mangabe." Schaefer decided not to ask what gave him that idea. He just shrugged and followed. They camped in the jungle, on the south side of the ridge, each night a little higher than the night before. Early on the 3rd day, after leaving Rio Sucio, the guide announced that they were crossing the border. Schaefer took his word for it. One stretch of hilly jungle looked like another, as far as he was concerned, and crossing the border didn't make the air any cooler, the humidity any less, the undergrowth any easier to get through. The only difference Schaefer could see was that the ground was now mostly sloping downward rather than up. They'd crossed the top of the ridge as well. Half a day later, the 2 men and their pack mules arrived at a spot in the jungle where the guide stopped, smiling, and waited expectantly. He didn't say anything, just waited, and it took Schaefer a moment to realize that he was supposed to be seeing something. That something here made this particular place different from the rest of the country. He looked, but at first he saw only more of the damn jungle. Then he made out the straight lines in the greenery ahead, the colors that weren't quite right, and put it all together. This was what the guide wanted to show him, what the guide had been aiming for. Schaefer was looking at the remains of a camp of some kind. He grunted to let the guide know that he had eventually figured it out. Then he dismounted and walked cautiously forward. It had been a good-sized encampment once. There had been several buildings, walls of bamboo or corrugated tin over wood frame, roofs of thatch, the traditional Central American palapa design. Here, some of the floors had been stone and concrete though, and that was not anything any of the ordinary villagers around here would bother with. 8 years of neglect and tropically enthusiastic plant growth had reduced the pavements to mere fragments, of course, as well as ruining just about everything else. 2 buildings, off to one side, were still standing, overgrown with greenery. The others were mostly green mounds of wreckage, full of rusting birds and squeaking rodents, and an occasional snake that fled when Schaefer came near. As he poked around in the ruins, Schaefer found a rusted blackened metal object he eventually identified as the burned-out remains of a helicopter. Other, smaller objects might have been a flatbed truck and a generator, and elsewhere there were fragments of steel drums, pieces of ammo boxes, sections of stone flooring, some of it burned, all of it encrusted with moss and vines. There were no bodies, but after 8 years there wouldn't be. The guide said something about guerrillas and rebels. Schaefer didn't bother to listen to that. It was clear enough even now. This had been a staging area of some sort, and someone had come calling with some heavy-duty shit. Brass shell casings, turned to green and black corruption by the jungle, were strewn everywhere. Schaefer could see blast patterns in the debris, and rapid-fire trails in the burned-out and rusted remains of vehicles and machinery. Schaefer had a pretty good idea who it was who dropped in. It smelled like one of his brother's operations. Messy, but thorough. He wondered why. Dutch had been in the rescue business, not search and destroy. Had there been hostages here? There could have been, certainly. So if Dutch had gone in after hostages, had he gotten them out? Did it matter? How did this relate to the thing Schaefer had fought in New York, the thing that had slaughtered Lamb and his men, and butchered everyone else in the police firing range. Dutch wouldn't have lost all of his men in an operation like this, an ordinary hostage recovery. That sort of stunt had been his bread and butter. Had that monster been one of the camp's defenders? Or might it have been sent to retrieve the hostages after Dutch had rescued them? Schaefer frowned, then returned to his mule. There wasn't anything here that was going to help him. He could spend weeks digging through the rubbish, and he doubted he'd find a clue if he tried. "There are no winners in a place like this," the guide said, sententiously. "Only the jungle." "Shut up," Schaefer told him, as he swung himself awkwardly up into the saddle. He wasn't in the mood to hear bad movie dialogue. If the guide thought that that sort of crap was going to impress anyone, he'd picked the wrong employer. "Which way?" he asked, and when he had his mount under control again. "How am I to say, senor?" the guide asked. Schaefer turned in the saddle and glared at him. The guide's smile vanished. Perhaps this way," he said, pointing. Schaefer nodded and followed as the guide rode on. A mile or two past the camp they headed northeast, down a narrow valley. It didn't look like the best route to Schaefer, but the guide led the way, and Schaefer didn't argue. The jungle looked different here, thicker, and somehow almost alien. Schaefer could see it in the trees, the plants, in everything. And it was hotter than ever. On the fourth day after leaving Rio Sucio, they crossed a small river, then picked their way down the side of a cliff into a broader valley where a good-sized river flowed. Here the jungle was even stranger. Schaefer looked around warily, trying to decide whether the strangeness had anything unnatural about it. "Do you feel it?" the guide asked, noticing Schaefer's discomfort. "You said you were looking for a thing that comes in the heat." It was hot enough, certainly. "This is where the natives say the sun appeared at midnight once, on a very hot night 8 years ago," the guide said with a sweeping gesture. Schaefer didn't answer. He was staring ahead. There was a break in the jungle, a hole where golden sunlight poured in. There was more than that, Schaefer saw, as his mule emerged into the light. There was a crater. Most of it was green, of course. Nothing could hold the jungle back for long. At the bottom lay a pool of mud and water, but ferns and creepers covered the bowl. The trees around the rim were already well over Schaefer's head. It was still plain that some time, not all that very long ago, something had cut a hole in the jungle a quarter of a mile across, had blasted away everything. Any normal explosion big enough to do that should have taken truckloads of explosives, and there should be visible wreckage, even now. And there wasn't. "My God," Schaefer said, staring. "What the hell happened here?" He sat and looked at the devastation for a moment longer, then demanded, "And what the hell did that bastard do to my brother?" He wondered whether he was looking at Dutch's grave. Probably not, since he knew Dutch had gotten out of here alive once. But had he come back, had he died here? If not Dutch, had his men died here? Billy and Hawkins and Blaine and the rest. And he also wondered what a Geiger counter would register here. That crater looked big enough to have been made by a small nuke. Who would be throwing that kind of ordnance around? He spent the remainder of the afternoon crisscrossing that crater, looking for some sign of what had happened, something that might tell him what he was up against. He didn't find it. There were no fragments, no scraps of wreckage, nothing he could find to indicate what had made that hole. At last he slogged back up out of the mud and asked the guide, "Now what?" The guide shrugged. "I do not know," he said. "The trail ends here." Schaefer knew that for bullshit. The guide hadn't been following any trail. He had known where to go. Schaefer supposed that the destroyed rebel base and this crater were famous. All the locals would have heard of them, would know they dated back to 8 years ago. This would be the natural place to lead someone who came looking for men who had vanished 8 years ago. But that seemed to be all this man knew, or at least all he would admit to. It looked as if it might be another dead end, but Schaefer wasn't in any hurry to give up. "We camp here," he said. The guide shrugged. That night Schaefer sat up late by the fire, thinking and remembering. He remembered that Dutch had talked about the thing as a hunter. He remembered how, as kids, he and Dutch would hunt in the woods behind their father's cabin. They hadn't looked on it as sport exactly. It was a challenge, being on their own, testing themselves against nature. One year, on the opening day of deer season, the two of them had come across a bunch of local boys, shooting up the woods. The lot of them had been drinking since daybreak, from the look of it, and they had this weird look in their eyes. Schaefer had figured they were all trying to impress each other with how wild and tough they were. Then Schaefer saw what they were shooting at. They cornered a buck and took turns pumping slugs into it, watching it bleed in the cool October air. Schaefer had been disgusted by it, by the unnecessary sloppy viciousness of it, the waste and the pain. But then he'd realised that those boys weren't really all that different from Dutch and himself. They were out there, pitting themselves against nature by killing deer. The only difference was that those boys needed to be wired up, needed to drive themselves into a killing frenzy, needed to see the blood. They had to make it into a perverse sort of fun, or they couldn't do it at all. Schaefer had thought that over carefully. He'd thought it over, and he decided that there was a world of difference between killing because you have to do whatever it is you're out to do, and killing because it's fun. Schaefer had decided he didn't want to kill for fun, and after that day he never had. But that didn't mean he hadn't killed. He was staring into the dying embers of the fire, thinking about that, when the thing in his neck suddenly jabbed at him. Not digging into the artery, but doing something that hurt. Even distracted by the pain, he knew what that had to mean. He hadn't felt anything like it before, but he'd have to be an idiot not to understand. The thing that had marked him was getting his attention, letting him know that it hadn't forgotten him. And it wouldn't bother doing that if it was still back in New York. It must have followed him. "Son of a bitch," he growled, clenching his fists in pain. "He's here." He looked around, scanning the jungle. He didn't see it anywhere. He knew it was out there, though. Maybe he wasn't going to find any clues to the thing's origins here. Maybe the crater wouldn't tell him anything. But he'd have a chance to tackle it again. And if he could kill it, who would care where it had come from?